They told her the Americans would cut off her hand. In the spring of 1945, as Germany's final defenses crumbled into chaos, a 23-year-old German nurse named Helga Richter huddled in a prisoner transport, her right hand wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. The injury was catastrophic. 3 days earlier, shrapnel from an Allied bombing raid had torn through flesh and bone, leaving her fingers crushed and twisted at unnatural angles. The infection had already begun. She could smell the sickly sweet rot spreading beneath the cloth. The other prisoners averted their eyes when they noticed it, their faces drawn with the silent understanding of what such wounds meant in wartime. "When the Americans see this," an older woman whispered, her voice hollow, "they will not waste their medicine on an enemy. They will take you to a table and remove it." That is what monsters do. Helga was a frontline nurse who had treated German soldiers in field hospitals across the Western Front. Now she was a prisoner, wounded and terrified, being delivered into the hands of an enemy she had been conditioned to fear more than death itself. The propaganda had been relentless. Americans were barbarians who tortured the wounded, who enjoyed the suffering of their captives, who showed mercy to no one. But 4 hours after arriving at the 307th Station Hospital, Helga would be lying on an operating table, tears streaming down her face, watching an American surgeon fight with stubborn determination to save every single one of her fingers. Captain Morrison would not speak her language, and she would not speak his. But what happened in that canvas tent would shatter everything she believed about humanity, about enemies, about the lies she had been fed. Now, let us go back to those final, desperate days, when one woman's fate hung between amputation and salvation. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, relax, grab your coffee, and enjoy this beautiful story. It's hard to believe now, but the truck that carried Helga and 18 other German prisoners lurched to a halt on a cratered road somewhere near Aachen. It was early April 1945, and the landscape bore the brutal scars of total war. Farmhouses stood gutted and skeletal against the ash-gray sky. Artillery craters pocked the fields where wheat should have been growing. The acrid smell of smoke mixed with the diesel fumes from American military vehicles that now controlled every road, every crossroads, every path forward. Helga pressed herself against the cold metal side of the transport, trying to make herself invisible. Her hand, God, her hand, throbbed with a deep, relentless agony that had become her entire universe over the past 3 days. She had wrapped it in strips torn from her own uniform. But the fabric was now soaked through with blood and something worse, something that smelled like death. She refused to look beneath the makeshift bandage. She refused to imagine what lay underneath. Around her, the other prisoners sat in exhausted, terrified silence. Most were women like herself, nurses, clerks, communication staff, who had served the Wehrmacht in auxiliary roles. Their uniforms were filthy and torn. Their faces were hollow with hunger and the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from knowing you've lost everything. Some had been captured just days ago as the American advance swept through. Others had been prisoners for weeks, shuffled from convoy to convoy as the Allies pushed deeper into collapsing Germany. "Where are they taking us?" a young woman with tangled blonde hair asked, her voice barely audible over the rumble of engines. Her name was Laisselle, and she had been a radio operator at a command post in the Rhineland. She looked perhaps 19, far too young for the horrors etched into her eyes. "Does it matter?" replied an older woman sitting across from them. Gertrude had been a head nurse at a military hospital before its capture. Despite the grime, her uniform still bore the insignia of medical service. "We are prisoners now. We go where they tell us to go." The truck jolted forward again, and Helga bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out as fresh waves of pain exploded through her injured hand. She had not eaten in 2 days. She had barely slept. The world had contracted to a nightmare of gray skies, grinding engines, and the constant, gnawing terror of what waited at the end of this journey. She thought of her mother in Hamburg, if Hamburg even still existed. The last letters she had received, months ago now, spoke of firestorms that had turned entire neighborhoods into crematoriums. She thought of the patients she had cared for, young soldiers with missing limbs and shattered minds. She thought of the propaganda films she had watched, the ones that showed American soldiers as monsters without conscience or compassion. And she looked down at her hand, hidden beneath its useless bandage, and knew with cold certainty that she would never use it again. The canvas flaps of the hospital tent parted, and Helga was carried inside on a stretcher into a world that made no sense. Light. Blinding white light from electric lamps strung across the ceiling. The sharp, clean smell of disinfectant cut through the rot of her wound. Around her, organized chaos. American nurses in crisp uniforms moving with swift efficiency, voices calling out in English, the clink of metal instruments, the rustle of sterile sheets. Helga's breath came in short, panicked gasps. This was it. This was where they would. A hand touched her shoulder, gentle, warm. She flinched, expecting pain. But the American nurse, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, simply squeezed once and moved on to adjust the stretcher. No sneer, no cruelty, just competence. "Easy now," a male voice said, in broken, heavily accented German. "You're safe now. We'll take care of you." Helga turned her head. A young medic with a Red Cross armband knelt beside her stretcher, his face open and earnest. Safe? The word felt like a foreign language. How could she be safe in the hands of the enemy? Then she saw it. Saw what shouldn't have been possible. 3 beds down, an American nurse was checking the bandages of a German soldier. Across the tent, a U.S. Army doctor examined a wounded German POW with the same careful attention he gave to the American GI beside him. No segregation, no brutality, just medicine. Everything she had been taught screamed that this was impossible. Americans were supposed to be monsters. They were supposed to enjoy suffering. They were supposed to... "Let me see that hand." Helga's head snapped toward the new voice. An American officer, captain's bars on his collar, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, stood over her stretcher. Captain Morrison. She didn't know his name yet, but she would never forget his face. He carefully unwrapped her makeshift bandage, and Helga watched his expression darken as he examined the crushed, blackened fingers. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment he would reach for the saw. Morrison's jaw tightened. He touched the swollen tissue with practiced fingers, his face grim. Helga closed her eyes, bracing for the words she'd been dreading. Instead, she heard him murmur something in English to his assistant. Words she couldn't understand. But when she opened her eyes, she saw something impossible in it. Hope, flickering in his tired gaze like a candle refusing to die. "We might not have to lose it," Morrison said quietly. Helga didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, and for the first time in 3 days, she dared to believe she might survive this with her hand intact. Captain Morrison scrubbed his hands in the metal basin, the water running pink with someone else's blood. He'd been operating for 16 hours straight. His shoulders ached. His eyes burned. 3 years of war had carved exhaustion into his bones, and still the wounded kept coming. American, British, German, it didn't matter anymore. They all bled the same. "Captain, we need to move fast on this one." His surgical assistant, Lieutenant Brennan, gestured toward the prep area where they were readying Helga for surgery. "That infection's deep, gone into the bone, maybe the bloodstream. Cleanest option is amputation. 20 minutes and we're done." Morrison stared at his hands. Clean now, ready to cut. "The penicillin shipment came in yesterday," he said quietly. "Sir, even with penicillin, look at that hand. The damage is extensive. We'd be operating for hours on tissue that might not survive anyway." "5 fingers or none," Morrison said, his voice harder now. "We try." Brennan opened his mouth to protest, then saw the set of Morrison's jaw and fell silent. Across the tent, Helga lay on the operating table as nurses prepped her arm. She caught fragments of English conversation, sharp, clipped words she couldn't decipher. The doctors were arguing about her hand. She knew what that meant. They're debating how quickly to remove it. Her mind drifted, seeking escape from the present terror. She was 18 again, standing in a hospital ward in Munich, watching her aunt, a surgical nurse, stitch a farmer's lacerated arm with steady, careful hands. "Medicine is mercy," her aunt had told her. "No matter who needs it." That belief had carried Helga through nursing school, through her enlistment, through the horror of field hospitals, where boys screamed and died in languages she barely understood. She had believed in healing, in helping. Then the propaganda had started. The films, the radio broadcasts. Americans are not like us. They have no compassion. They will destroy you. But nothing she'd been told matched what she'd seen in this tent. The gentle touch, the careful examination, the way Morrison had looked at her hand not with disgust, but with determination. "Fräulein?" A nurse appeared beside her, holding a mask. "This will help you sleep." Helga wanted to protest, wanted to beg them not to take her hand, but her German stuck in her throat. The mask lowered over her face. The sharp smell of ether filled her lungs. Through blurring vision, she saw Morrison approach the table, his hands gloved and ready. His eyes met hers for one brief moment. Then darkness swallowed everything. The first incision released the smell of infection. Thick, putrid, unmistakable. Morrison didn't flinch. He'd smelled worse. "Debriding infected tissue," he murmured, his scalpel moving with surgical precision. Black, necrotic flesh peeled away to reveal the devastation beneath. Shattered metacarpals, torn tendons hanging like frayed rope. Nerves severed clean through. Beside him, Lieutenant Brennan worked in tense silence, suctioning blood and pus as Morrison excavated the wound. Across the table, a German POW nurse, requisitioned to assist, stood frozen, watching an American surgeon fight to save what her own military would have amputated without hesitation. "Tendon intact on the index finger," Morrison whispered. His voice was steady, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Infection isolated to the ring and middle fingers. We can work with this." 2 hours in, his hands cramped. He ignored them. He irrigated the wound with penicillin solution, precious, experimental, their only advantage against the sepsis spreading through her tissue. Then came the painstaking work of reconstruction. Aligning bone fragments, drilling tiny holes for wire fixation, rebuilding the architecture of a hand that had been crushed into ruin. Suture, Morrison said. Brennan passed it wordlessly. Stitch by stitch, Morrison reconnected torn nerves. Delicate work that would determine whether she'd ever feel those fingers again. The tent was silent, except for the hiss of the pressure lamp and the whisper of surgical thread through flesh. One more stitch, Morrison breathed. Just one more. In the darkness behind her eyelids, Helga dreamed. Her mother's kitchen in Hamburg, sunlight streaming through windows that no longer existed. Her aunt teaching her to tie surgical knots, explaining that medicine knew no borders. Then the propaganda films. Americans with cruel faces, Americans who laughed at suffering. Americans who were monsters in human skin. But the hands working on her now were not monstrous. They were trying to save her. 4 hours after the first incision, Morrison stepped back from the table. His hands trembled with exhaustion. His back screamed in protest. But all 5 fingers remained. Bandaged, splinted, swollen. But there. All 5 fingers there, he said quietly. The entire surgical team exhaled as one. The German nurse's eyes glistened with tears she wouldn't let fall. Morrison stripped off his gloves and walked out of the tent into the gray dawn. Artillery rumbled in the distance. The war was still raging, still consuming lives by the thousands. But in this moment, in this small canvas hospital, one life had been fought for. One enemy had been treated as human. Morrison stood in the cold morning air, bone-tired and oddly at peace. Somewhere behind him, Helga Richter was still alive, still whole. Helga surfaced from darkness slowly, like drowning in reverse. The first thing she felt was pain, dull, throbbing, but somehow contained, manageable. Not the screaming agony of infection spreading through dying tissue. The second thing she felt was terror. My hand. She forced her eyes open. White canvas ceiling, the smell of antiseptic. Distant voices speaking English. She was still in the American hospital. Her right arm lay elevated on pillows, wrapped in pristine white bandages from fingertips to elbow. She stared at it, afraid to hope, afraid to even try. Move. She commanded her fingers to move, expecting nothing, expecting the dead weight of absence. They twitched, all 5 of them. She felt them, felt the pull of muscle and tendon beneath the bandages, felt the living proof that her hand was still there, still hers. The tears came before she could stop them. Great, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. Hey, it's all right. A nurse appeared beside her bed, the same gray-haired woman from before. She touched Helga's shoulder with impossible gentleness. You're all right. The surgery went well. Helga couldn't stop crying, couldn't speak. Another nurse arrived, a younger woman who gestured to someone across the ward. A moment later, a German-speaking translator approached, a thin man with kind eyes who wore an American uniform. Fräulein, he said softly, you are in the recovery ward. Your hand was saved. All 5 fingers. Why? The word tore from Helga's throat. Why would you? I am the enemy. Why would Americans save? The translator smiled, sad and knowing. He didn't even need to consult the nurses. Because we are all human, he said simply. The word struck her like a physical blow. Over the following days, Helga observed her new reality. The recovery ward, part of what the Americans called Camp Swift, housed dozens of wounded prisoners, German soldiers, German support staff, all treated with the same care as American wounded. She watched guards address prisoners by name, not number. Watched medics patiently adjust IV lines and actually ask if someone needed pain medication. Watched German and American patients share cigarettes in a smoker's corner. Enemy and liberator sitting side by side under the same canvas roof. Every interaction dismantled another brick in the wall of lies she'd been taught. That night, by the light of a small lamp, Helga pulled out the battered diary she'd kept throughout the war. Her left hand shook as she wrote, "My hand is saved. 5 fingers. The American doctor fought for hours to keep what our own military would have discarded. I no longer understand the world I thought I knew. I fear I may never see it the same way again. Perhaps that is not a tragedy. Perhaps that is mercy." "Good. Very good, Fräulein Richter." The American physical therapist, a cheerful sergeant named Davies, clapped his hands as Helga managed to curl her bandaged fingers slightly inward. The movement was tiny, painful, but it was movement. Around the rehabilitation tent, other medics paused to watch. One whistled appreciatively. Another called out, "Keep going, you've got this." Helga stared at them, bewildered. They were celebrating her recovery? An enemy's recovery? "Again," Davies said, his smile genuine. "Show me one more time." She tried. Her fingers trembled, obeyed. The medics cheered like she'd won a race. The following afternoon, a new transport of German POWs arrived. 30 women, hollow-eyed and shaking. Helga watched from the recovery ward as an American officer, a major with gray at his temples, addressed them in carefully practiced German. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying across the compound. "You did not start this war, and neither did I. We are all victims of war. You will be treated with dignity here. You have my word." One of the new prisoners, barely 18, her face streaked with tears, looked up at him with naked disbelief. The major nodded to his men. "Get them fed, get them warm." The days blurred into a pattern of small revolutionary kindnesses. On cold evenings, an American corporal brought hot cocoa to the German prisoners in the recovery ward, passing out tin cups with a crooked grin. "Drink up. Doctor's orders." Helga watched Gertrude, the former German nurse, engage in an animated discussion with an American surgical nurse about wound closure techniques, their hands moving in the universal language of medicine despite the language barrier. Guards used first names. "Morning, Helga. How's the hand today?" "Liesel," mail call, "package from the Red Cross for your ward." No numbers, no dehumanization, just people. Liesel, the young radio operator, sat beside Helga one evening, her voice quiet. "I was so afraid. I thought they would—" She couldn't finish. "I know," Helga whispered. "I thought the same." An American nurse, Margaret, who always hummed while she worked, joined them, offering a pack of cigarettes. The 3 women sat together, in comfortable silence, the boundaries of nation and uniform dissolving into something simpler, human. That night, Helga unwrapped her bandages for the scheduled dressing change. Her fingers were swollen, scarred, but unmistakably alive. All 5 of them. She stared at them for a long moment. At the hand an enemy had refused to take. At the fingers an enemy had fought to save. Gratitude welled up inside her, vast and wordless, too large for her chest to contain. She flexed them slowly, carefully, and for the first time in years, she smiled without fear. May 8th, 1945. The announcement crackled over the camp loudspeakers at noon. Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. For a moment, Camp Swift held its breath. Then, Explosion. Cheers erupted from every corner. American soldiers embraced, some weeping openly. Someone fired a rifle into the air. Another began singing. Within minutes, the entire camp was alive with celebration. Music, laughter, the wild release of men who'd survived hell and lived to see its end. Helga stood in the recovery ward doorway, watching. The American flag rose slowly up the main flagpole, snapping in the spring breeze, red, white, and blue against a cloudless sky. Around her, American medics and soldiers celebrated with a joy she couldn't quite share. Her homeland had been defeated, destroyed. Everything she'd known, the cities, the structures, the lies she'd been fed, had crumbled into ash and ruin. But watching these men celebrate not with cruelty toward their German prisoners, but with simple relief that the killing had finally stopped, she felt something unexpected. Not quite joy, but something close. Something like hope. Fräulein Richter. She turned. Captain Morrison stood behind her, still in his surgical whites, exhaustion and relief written across his face. "Your hand," he said through the translator who'd hurried over. "The recovery is remarkable. You'll have nearly full function, I think." Helga looked down at her hand, still bandaged, still tender, but undeniably whole. She looked back up at Morrison, at this man who'd fought for 4 hours to save what everyone else would have discarded. She wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him he'd saved more than her hand. He'd saved her belief in humanity itself. But the words stuck in her throat, too large and too small all at once. "Thank you," she managed finally in broken English. "Thank you." Morrison nodded, understanding everything she couldn't say. Then he was gone, pulled back into the celebrations. Within days, preparations for repatriation began. Lists of names, transportation schedules. German prisoners heading back to a homeland that no longer existed as they'd known it. Helga lay awake that night, staring at the canvas ceiling. Who would she be when she returned? What would she do in a Germany built on the ruins of the lies she'd believed? She flexed her fingers slowly, still stiff, still healing, but alive. This hand was proof that mercy existed, that enemies could choose compassion over cruelty, that everything she'd been taught was wrong. She would return to Germany. She would rebuild. But she would build differently, based not on propaganda and hatred, but on what she'd learned here in this American camp, from this American surgeon. She would build on mercy. The train carried Helga back into Germany in June 1945, and what she saw through the window broke her heart. Hamburg was a graveyard. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, skeletal buildings clawing at empty skies. Refugees shuffled through streets where children once played, their faces hollow with hunger and loss. The Third Reich had promised glory and delivered only ash. Helga stepped off the train with nothing but the clothes on her back and a hand that shouldn't have been there. She became a nurse again. Not for the Wehrmacht. That was gone, shattered like everything else. But for the displaced, the starving, the broken people trying to rebuild from ruins. She worked in makeshift clinics where medicine was scarce and hope even scarcer. But she brought something with her that the war hadn't destroyed: the memory of mercy. When patients arrived terrified, expecting cruelty, she offered gentleness. When young nurses asked why she treated former enemies with the same care as Germans, she told them about an American surgeon who'd spent 4 hours saving the hand of a woman he had every reason to let die. "Propaganda taught us to hate," she would say, flexing her scarred fingers. One act of kindness taught me we were wrong. Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes, slowly, painfully, but rebuild it did. Helga married a school teacher named Ernst in 1952. Together they worked to create a Germany that would never again fall prey to the lies that had consumed their youth. She became an instructor at a nursing school in Frankfurt, training hundreds of young nurses over 2 decades. Her saved hand became her symbol. She would hold it up during lectures, scarred, slightly crooked, but functional, and tell her students, "This hand reminds me that we are all human, that mercy transcends borders, that one person's choice to help can change an entire life." She kept 2 sacred items in her desk drawer: a faded photograph of her healed hand, taken in 1946, and the diary entry she'd written that night in Camp Swift. "I fear I may never see the world the same way again. Perhaps that is mercy." Spring 1967, 22 years after the war's end. Helga sat in her office, grading student papers, when a colleague knocked on her door. "Helga, I was looking through an American medical journal. You won't believe what I found." He handed her the journal, pointing to an article about wartime surgical innovations. Listed among the contributors, Captain James Morrison, MD, Columbus, Ohio. Helga's heart stopped. Her hand, the hand he'd saved, began to tremble. After 22 years, she'd found him. October 1967, Helga stepped off the Greyhound bus in Columbus, Ohio, and into a world she'd never imagined she'd see. Peaceful American streets. Autumn leaves drifting past tidy suburban homes. Children playing without fear. No ruins, no hunger, no war. She clutched a worn envelope containing a single photograph, her healed hand, taken 22 years ago, and an address she'd obtained through careful correspondence with the American Medical Association, 2847 Maple Drive. Her heart hammered as violently as it had in that prisoner transport in 1945. She was just as terrified now as she'd been then, though for entirely different reasons. What if he didn't remember? What if she was just another patient among thousands? What if... She knocked. Footsteps inside. The door opened. Captain Morrison, no, just Morrison now, stood before her. Gray-haired where he'd been dark. Lines carved deeper around kind eyes. A cardigan instead of army fatigues. But unmistakably him. He looked at her, puzzled. "Can I help you?" Helga's carefully prepared English deserted her. Instead, she simply raised her right hand. 5 fingers. Scarred but whole. Steady and strong. Morrison's eyes widened. His face went pale. He stared at the hand, then at her face, recognition dawning like sunrise. "Fräulein," he whispered. "Fräulein Richter?" "Helga," she managed, tears already streaming. "My name is Helga." Morrison's composure shattered. He stepped forward and pulled her into an embrace. This former enemy, this woman whose life he'd fought to save in a canvas tent while artillery thundered in the distance. They stood there on his front porch, both weeping, no words necessary. Because what could words add to this? To the proof that mercy mattered? That one choice made in exhaustion and compassion could ripple forward through decades? Finally, Morrison pulled back, holding her hand gently, examining his own work from 22 years ago. The scars. The slight crookedness of the ring finger. The living, breathing proof that he'd chosen right. "You kept it," he said, his voice thick. "You saved it," Helga replied. "You saved everything." Later, sitting in his living room with coffee neither of them drank, Helga thought about that day in 1945. The terror, the pain, the certainty that she would lose her hand, her humanity, her life. And she thought about the man across from her, who'd looked at an enemy and seen only a human being who needed help. "Thank you," she said finally, inadequately, "for seeing me when you could have looked away." Morrison shook his head. "I just did what any doctor should do." "No," Helga said firmly. "You did what any human should do. And it changed my entire life." She flexed her fingers. Those 5 fingers that shouldn't have been there, that had become her life's symbol and mission. One act of mercy had saved more than a hand. It had saved a lifetime.